This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. At APEC in November, Joe Biden patted ex-San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom on the chest and said Newsom could be anything he wants, including the next president. And so part of the soft launch of the Newsom presidency is him selling people in California and the rest of the states on his version of the Norway model of imprisonment, which if you search for the Norway model of prisons online, you will see articles describing it as the humane approach to prisons, with photos of jail cells that look kind of like the rooms at an IKEA. The model for what Newsom is branding as his California model is here in the Bay at San Quentin, where Newsom is basically saying that he's re-envisioning prisons as rehab centers. We've seen this so many times, like in 2006 when the CDC, the California Department of Corrections, added rehabilitation to the end of its name, becoming the CDCR. We know that forced rehab has a 99% fail rate, which is what Newsom seems to be aiming for with his statewide drug courts and the California model, and his rebranding of San Quentin State Prison into the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. It's also essentially the same thing that London Breed is trying to do in the city with forced conservatorship, where she's disappearing unhoused people into asylums she originally wanted to call behavioral health justice centers, which is something we covered in the episode of San Francisco with friends of mine, Tori and Thatcher, and I'll link that inside the show notes. So while Newsom could spend money giving people basics like housing, food, and more schools, instead he is happy to make some people who will help his campaign so rich by spending more on expanding the prison state. And all of this was announced with a game of pickleball in May, where the CDCR invited the media to what it called the first ever pickleball event. People inside and the wardens and the COs all played pickleball in front of many cameras. To give some more context, today on the show, Emile Suotonye DeWeaver from Oakland has written for places like Truth Out and The Appeal and The Bayview about how prisons use public relations to expand the prison system. He was formerly incarcerated at San Quentin, and so he saw firsthand what is truly just a rebrand. Emile Suotonye DeWeaver is an Oakland-based, formerly incarcerated Black activist and the owner of Reframe LLC, which is dedicated to evolving institutions through culture change. To start us off, I'm going to ask you to lay out Gavin Newsom's California model, his pitch to all of us in the state about how he's going to transform the prison system.
Yeah, Toshio, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I think I would start with, it's exactly as you described it, it's a pitch. And the pitch is that he's going to transform the California prison system to more mirror the prison systems in Norway, which have like a very strong rehabilitative focus, and they treat their incarcerated people more like citizens than we do in the United States, because they are citizens. His version of this plan is to tear down death row in San Quentin and build what he calls a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center. And he's promising more job training, more drug treatment, more rehabilitation program access. And he wants to scale this model across California to every prison in California. The price tag that's been quoted that he's offering is for just San Quentin $360 million, and some quoted at $380 million, but that, according to the Legislative Analysis Office, a very, just like an unrealistic like budget projection. They projected it much higher than that.
And this is at the same time that the state is looking at cutting at, austerity for other pieces of the budget. I was wondering if you could speak to how this might work to expand the prison system, to sort of medicalize the prison system and funnel money away from alternatives to incarceration.
Currently, he's trying to sell Californians on the idea that he's going to revolutionize correctional culture in California because Californians have been demanding it, like the entire US has been demanding something different than mass incarceration because it's not working and it's making us less safe and it's breaking our budgets, it's killing our schools, it's killing our health care. He's focusing on making a new building, which has nothing to do with culture, and hoping that that changes the culture. I really honor and respect that you're framing as like a writer and perhaps a journalist that like how it might go. But I would say that it's not a question, it's less a question of how it might go and more a question of how it's all, for all intents and purposes, likely to go. And he's in essence surrendering millions and eventually billions of dollars to CDCR. The legislative analysts, I mentioned earlier that they're saying you're underestimating the price tag on this because in your own plan, you're taking on debt, and then that debt service is going to cost $25 million a year. So for this plan, just for San Quentin, we're talking closer to $680 million. And to scale it, we're talking $800 million a year, which is $20 billion just in debt service over 25 years. And so this is the kind of money that he's essentially handing over to CDCR. And the biggest problem with that is this direct correlation in like studies. Direct correlation might be too strong a word, but there are studies who have shown that the more money correctional agencies get, the stronger their unions become. And that makes like common sense, but they did studies on it. And so what that means is Newsom will be increasing the footprint of the very problem he's trying to solve. And then when they fail to deliver on the culture change he's promising, there'll be no way to actually hold them accountable because they're already not accountable with the current power structures that exist. So you're going to give them more power, and it's going to be even less likely that you can hold them accountable. It's not a question of, we'll maybe give it a chance. It's like, CDCR has a long history of this exact same maneuver. There was the time when there was like several $million spent on building a state-of-the-art hospital because there was outcry in the public about medical treatment and medical conditions in San Quentin State Prison. So they got a bunch of money. They built this huge hospital that today is a virtual medical ghost town. And I say that from the perspective of a person who was incarcerated in San Quentin and who received medical treatment in San Quentin and has been to that building hundreds, if not thousands of times. And in that building, basically the medical staff that we see and that treat us are for the most part contained to the first floor. And it's basically holding cells and offices to take our blood pressure and like distribute our medication if we have medication. And the rest of the hospital has been essentially purposed to office space for medical staff, repurposed to storage and office space for correctional officers. And the reason I know that is I used to file a lot of like grievances and 602s. And often when my grievances were heard, I would be taken to the hospital and taken to one of the upper floors. And I would walk through these floors and they would be virtually empty except for porters and the occasional staff member walking around. And we would sit in these offices and that's where they would hear my grievances. I think that in the 6 or 7 years that I was in San Quentin, I can't really track time that well. So like, it's hard for me to give years. It's just like one of the traumas of being in prison for 21 years. In that time, I think that I had been in those upper floors for medical reasons and not medical treatment, just medical reasons, maybe twice. And again, I would be taken up there and the whole place would just be empty. So here you have this promise that, okay, we're going to fix medical care. What we need is a bunch of money to do it. They get the money, they build the building, but like medical care hasn't changed because the culture hasn't changed. And in the same way, they're going to tear down death row. They don't have a plan right now that they're like actually sharing with the public. They're just saying we're going to do it as we go, and we're going to make it happen. And you're tearing down this whole building full of asbestos. You're basically about to create a toxic waste site, and then say you're going to like build a state-of-the-art institution on top of it. The hospital's not the only example. They did the same thing with DJJ, which used to be the California Youth Authority, and they did this rebranding of it, like, oh, we're going to focus on rehabilitation because children need rehabilitation and we shouldn't treat them like adults. And so they changed the name, but they didn't change the culture. And now they're shutting DJJ down because it's like such a catastrophe of staff inciting violence amongst the youth, abusing people. It's so disgraceful that they're literally shutting it down. So we have these patterns. California Corrections behaves and how they move power and how they take in money only to keep doing the same thing. And you have Newsom now proposing what seems like this brand new idea, and he's hitting all the buzzwords like progressive rehabilitation and humane conditions and job training. But the reality is he's just doing more of the same thing.
Absolutely. So selling a sort of makeover and redevelopment of physical buildings when the soul of these places remains the same. The reason for these buildings existing remains the same, to cage human beings. And there are so many people that are going to benefit from this. As you mentioned, there are banks that are going to make money off of the loans. There's the prison guard union, which traditionally has the most sway with politicians in Sacramento. In a piece you wrote for The Appeal, which we will link in the show notes for this episode, you write that the California model represents the near enemy of progress. Could you explain that concept?
I can. I do want to touch real briefly on what you said about like who benefits, because it's these interests that you name. But I think it's also important to name that the governor, as part of his pitch, has assembled this advisory board that's supposed to be representative of the community. So he can, like, because like in California politics, especially in progressive politics, it's no longer acceptable to just do shit. Like you have to like at least appear to be involving the people impacted, the actual experts, the people on the ground, to legitimate whatever you're doing. Otherwise, you easily cast just like an arrogant white man who's still pushing the same white supremacist I know it all. And it's not that Newsom is doing something else. He's just maneuvering so it seems like he's doing something else. And this will figure into like the near enemy explanation. Because when you look at the advisory board, you hear a community crying out, don't do this. This is a bad idea. All the people who are on the ground doing the work are like, this is a bad idea. And they're saying, what's going to happen is exactly like kind of the things that I'm talking about in this article. But he has this board to kind of yes man his agenda, and there are a bunch of people who will benefit. They're like reentry programs. They're like organizations who receive like mass funding from channels related to CDCR, or they work with CDCR and require CDCR for their business to even work. A good example of this is Chris Redlich, who runs the Last Mile program in San Quentin, which is like training incarcerated people to code, which for an incarcerated person is great. Like that's a great skill to have. But the reality of that program is it's deeply exploitative. And I know this because I know a lot of people in it. So you have Governor Newsom saying, I'm going to build this state-of-the-art building and provide job training, dollar to a donut. It's going to be a large expansion of the Last Mile program, and they're going to get more incarcerated people and like train them in coding, which is great. But then the part that they do it for so that they can then basically export cheap prison labor to tech companies who can pay incarcerated, like if they paid incarcerated people $30 an hour, an incarcerated person would like lose their mind. They'd be like, man, that's great, right? But the reality is the payment you give an engineer is much more than that. So like rather than exporting jobs overseas, they're just exporting them into the prison labor pool. You have organizations on the advisory board who are like deep into reentry programs. And of course, what do you know? They're talking about reentry hubs as part of this program, and they make it sound like it's like a great transitional kind of housing thing. But most of them so far are actually just other facilities that aren't even outside the prison. So like a person who's supposed to be released from prison is released to this thing inside the prison, or maybe just right outside the walls of prison, and you're basically still living in a prison setting. But you brand it with the word like reentry and like rejoining the community, but it's just a larger footprint of CDCR in collaboration with the nonprofit industrial complex organization that draw their living from the problem that they're supposedly trying to solve. So I think it's really important to expand the like benefits of this, because it's easy to see like Black faces or formerly incarcerated faces on the advisory board and be like, well, like they're with it, so maybe there's something to it. It's like, no, there are, as in all systems of oppression, there are interests and there are stakes and there are people who move towards the status quo in order to build more for themselves. And then, there are people who are trying to change it. And those are the voices of people like Herb and the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and like activists on the ground that are actually have always been working for communities and for the people, and who actually have the answers of how we revolutionize this system that Governor Newsom conveniently has no ears for. The near enemy of progress is it's a Buddhist idea. It's very old. It traditionally deals with emotional states. So like a far enemy is easy to say, like the far enemy of love is hate. But near enemies are much more insidious because they resemble the emotional state we value, but they actually undermine it. A good example would be like pity is the near enemy of compassion, or obsession is the near enemy of love. These things can look like they're the same, especially to an outside observer looking at it. But in fact, they are states that, unlike pity, fundamentally undermines compassion, because pity is a separation of you and the subject, where compassion is more rooted in empathy, and that is identification and like connection and like joining. In my activist work, I like to translate this idea to social states. Like cancel culture is a near enemy of accountability. It can feel like accountability because like you're hurting someone who did something wrong, but it actually doesn't actually lend itself to accountability. It actually undermines the accountable process. Identity politics is the near enemy of centering the voices of impacted people. Centering the voices of impacted people is very important and should always be done. And sometimes the way we play identity politics tends to just reverse the hierarchies of white supremacy in small spaces and gives the bludgeoning tool to the oppressed group to use in the same way that the oppressing group uses. So it doesn't actually lend itself to like more liberation and more justice in the world, but it can feel like. And so the California model is exactly that. It can feel like progress. It can feel like a step forward, especially because the system is using all the right buzzwords and getting buy-in from organizations that ostensibly are labeled social justice organizations. But in reality, what he's actually doing, because he's not actually rearranging power dynamics and he's not actually demanding a change in the culture that he's trying to build this project on, what he's actually doing is just doubling down on the power structures that actually exist.
Absolutely. One of the concepts that I like to hammer home is how the Bay Area does end up being the birthplace of a lot of these liberal policies that, are sort of cloaked as progress, but actually do, increase the repression or oppression that they're allegedly there to get rid of. As you mentioned, there's the state-of-the-art hospital that was built adjacent to San Quentin, or actually in the San Quentin grounds. This seems to me like another example, like as San Francisco tries to institute more conservatorship, more forced rehab.
I'm not like deeply versed in the strategies on the table for prisons expanding their medical care, but I will say that it's part of a long trend of like basically turning over our public health services to correctional agencies that aren't suited for it. And a great example of them not being suited for it is like, they have this state-of-the-art hospital and COVID hit, and people are flying out of that prison in ambulances to the free world medical facilities. So you have this millions and tens of millions of dollars hospital that you built, and you can't even treat a COVID patient. And you can't. And the reason why they can't treat a COVID patient is because at least when I was in prison there, the doctor only had. I mean, the hospital only had one doctor that was only there certain days of the week. It was just like nurses and RNs doing the work, and the doctor would come in and sign papers, right? Or like he'd come in, like I've never I don't think I've ever had an X-ray in there, but I'm sure some people get X-rays or like high-tech machinery done on them at some point. He would have to then be present for that, right? So the idea of making medical care in prison better is just kind of oxymoronic. And what it basically comes down to is we will, in essence, be giving the prison more funds to do nothing. And they'll spend those funds on like window dressing to like make it do something. Like a building is window dressing. It's a physical manifestation that says this is what you got from this money. But nothing actually really changes, or very little actually changes, because at the end of the day, prisons and jails should not be the providers of medical care because they're not medical professionals, right? And that's not their priority.
I was wondering if you could talk about how San Quentin specifically fits into the governor's pitch. How is Newsom using San Quentin as sort of a model for what he wants to do around the state?
So, like, on television, San Quentin has this reputation as like, oh, this like horrible prison where like, this XYZ serial killer is on death row. But the reality of San Quentin has been like a hub of so-called rehabilitation. I say so-called rehabilitation because I have some problems with rehabilitation as a concept as we practice it, and like these ideas of redemption narratives that are problematic in themselves. But it's had a reputation for a very long time in correctional circles and the nonprofit world and the social justice world as a hub of rehabilitation. When I was in prison, there were about 5,000 people in San Quentin, and there were about 5,000 volunteers coming in every year to run a program. That is something that guards on the ground have never been happy about. And so when COVID hit, they used that as an excuse to shut most of those programs down. And we're many years, maybe not many years, but we're several years outside of like the intense COVID lockdowns in prisons. And many of those programs are struggling even to get started again. Like the prison is like playing gatekeeper and obstructing them being started. So in reality, if like Governor Newsom was super interested in like creating a focus on rehabilitation, it seems like that would be step one. Just like use the facilities that you already have to do what this prison had been doing for a long time before COVID gave prison administrators the excuse to shut them down. Newsom is trying to parlay that brand into saying that, like, I can be responsible for a prison doing this right and get the political capital that, like, he'll no doubt try to use one day to run for president to push this plan, to make this plan sound feasible and believable and get buy-in to it from many of the organizations and people who have been shut out and want to get back in to support their own like nonprofit industrial complex. The way that I got involved in this, because I don't watch the news that much anymore for a number of reasons, but I didn't even know it was happening. And a friend called me, he's like, "Hey, Mel, she's like, I want to talk to you and another friend of mine about Governor Newsom's like California model." And we get to dinner, and she's talking about this model with like stars in her eyes. And this woman's an abolitionist, right? And I'm like sitting there like dumbstruck. And like, I'm kind about it, but inside what I'm thinking is, how in the fuck do you need me to tell you this is a bad idea? It's a horrible idea. But the thing is, like, we live in a country that's predominantly acculturated to whiteness, is that whiteness it has a hard time dealing with discomfort. And the discomfort of this work that can sometimes always feel like we're losing or taking steps back is so intense. Anything that appears to be a step forward, we can like jump on it with like a sense of desperation. And that's what's happening, because even when I'm telling her what's wrong with this plan, the cognitive dissonance going on for her is like, yeah, but what about this? Isn't this good? Would it be great if there wasn't a death row anymore? Is they just kind of find it's almost like a defeatist attitude, right? Even so, like people on the council who like you'll talk to and in private, they're like, this is fuck, but like they want to be at the table. They're like, but like if no one's at the table, then we can't even mitigate the harm. And it's like these trade-offs that we make that aren't actually good for us, right? Rather than demanding the right things be done, it's kind of an admission that we have no power and we can't change this world and we can't change the way we do things. So we got to do this little thing. We got to let this horrible thing happen because it gives us these good things. We let this horrible thing happen because at least it ends death row in San Quentin. We got to let these horrible things happen because at least 200 more incarcerated people will have a better education. So it's like he's using that tension between the despair and the kind of like the emptiness that kind of comes with this work and the euphoria that can come from feeling like we're making steps forward.
That makes so much sense. Yeah, that the bar is just so low for, feeling like we're, I guess, having successes on the side of quote unquote progress, that we're going to grasp onto whatever glint of positivity that we can see. And I mean, for that reason, I think it's so important that we do demand the most and not settle, because the enemies of progress are never about demanding everything from us. So yeah, that I think is a really important point and one that we could close out on. But before we do that, I was wondering if you could tell people how they can find you or follow your work online.
Yeah, you can find me at reframeconsults.com and you can contact me through like the contact form. Probably the best way to see the kind of work that I do and to hit me up to collaborate. The other thing that I would say, like aside from contacting me, is like talking about like, okay, this is a waste of money, but what could we be using this money on? Like California United for a Responsible Budget, put like out a whole document on what we should be doing with the money and how we can be changing this culture and how we can actually solve the problem of mass incarceration. Like I read it, I've been doing this work a long time, and it's like, yeah, that's useful. That's something that can work. That's something that will both increase our safety, free up the money to invest in our communities, and also shrink the footprint of an agency that if it were like a corporation, like these motherfucking their shareholders would have shut their ass down like 50 years ago because they're only producing what they want to produce, and that's more incarceration when what they claim to want to produce is more public safety, which is not what they do. Well, I want to also end on that note that, yes, let's deconstruct this, let's not do this, but let's also educate ourselves on what can be done and what will work. And my Curb has a great guide for that.
Cool. And we'll link to that too in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Caitlin Wood. You go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco. That is where all of our past episodes live, including the one on conservatorship that I mentioned. Thank you so much to Pancho Vita for being the newest member of the Sad Francisco family. I'll see you next time in Sad Francisco.